Go Vonnen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to have just a little fun, poking fun at myself and other Tolkien geeks like you good people who watch this channel, because after all, if you can't laugh at yourself, there's probably something wrong with you. So, on that theory, let's take a look at you might be a Tolkien geek if. You might be a Tolkien geek if you can actually answer the question, do you prefer Sindarin or Quenya? You might be a Tolkien geek if you've ever taken a course in Tolkien's Elvish languages. You might be a Tolkien geek if you've ever given your girlfriend or significant other a coupon book in Elvish for her birthday with basically rewards that she has to decipher. You might be a Tolkien geek if you ever tried to get your classmates to learn Elvish so that you could pass notes back and forth in code. You might be a Tolkien geek if you've ever written out Christmas tags in Elvish characters. You might be a Tolkien geek if you heard about the Lord of the Rings edition of Trivial Pursuit and thought it was a great idea, and then found out it was based on the movies and thought, well, what's the point of that? You might be a Tolkien geek when you hear other authors like George R.R. Martin or C.S. Lewis compared to Tolkien, and you kind of go ballistic. You might be a Tolkien geek if you'll only watch the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson. You might be a Tolkien geek if you think the best adaptation of the Lord of the Rings is the NPR radio dramatization because it is by far the most accurate. If we're sticking to movies, you might be a Tolkien geek if you think the Ralph Bakshi movie is by far the best. You might be a Tolkien geek if your significant other makes you a handmade quilt with embroidered quotes from The Lord of the Rings and other Tolkien works. Of course, you can't be a Tolkien geek if you don't have an entire bookshelf dedicated to Tolkien works. You might be a Tolkien geek because you enjoy Beowulf not because you took an English lit class, but because Tolkien was really into Beowulf. You might be a Tolkien geek if you think fairy tales are for adults because Tolkien said so, dang it. You might be a Tolkien geek if your significant other ever bought an extra copy of a Tolkien book just so they could write an Ottendorf cipher. You might be a Tolkien geek if you ever kept a journal in Elvish. You might be a Tolkien geek if you have listened to all of the Tolkien Professor's podcast episodes, Tolkien Professor being, of course, Dr. Corey Olson. You might be a Tolkien geek if you want to read the original version of The Hobbit, and you know what that means. You might be a Tolkien geek if you tend to get nothing but Tolkien-related gifts at Christmas or your birthday, and your family is running short of ideas. You might be a Tolkien geek if you read more than just The Hobbit, Silmarillion, and Lord of the Rings, and branched out into the History of Middle-earth series and biographies and letters by Tolkien. You might be a Tolkien geek if your dream vacation is to New Zealand. You might be a Tolkien geek if you hear about a new Tolkien project and your first thought is, yes, more Tolkien. And then the other part of your brain kicks in and you think, but they'll ruin it. You might be a Tolkien geek if you catch wind of a rumor that there might be a Tolkien Middle-earth related theme park somewhere down the line, and your first thought is, but I've already been to Middle-earth. You might be a Tolkien geek if your significant other has heard you talk about Tolkien so much that even though they're not particularly interested in the topic, they can hold a conversation about it. You might be a Tolkien geek if your 3-year-old can identify all the major characters from The Lord of the Rings. You might be a Tolkien geek if you think that a super complicated board game based on The Lord of the Rings is the most awesome thing ever, but a slapped-on theme is just awful. You might be a Tolkien geek if your wife's decor is vastly outnumbered by the amount of Tolkien stuff you have hanging around the house. You might be a Tolkien geek if you're ever watching a Lord of the Rings based movie or listening to some other adaptation, and you're constantly annoyed by all the mispronunciations because you read Appendix E. You might be a Tolkien geek if you keep asking your son at night, can we read The Hobbit? You might be a Tolkien geek if you know the name of every major weapon in The Lord of the Rings. You might be a Tolkien geek if you read not only the main part of The Lord of the Rings, but all the appendices that come after it. You might be a Tolkien geek if you held a game night where the game was the Lord of the Rings trivia game, which actually is about the book, and it was you against everybody else, and you kind of ran away with it. You might be a Tolkien geek if you cringe at the idea of using the One Ring as a wedding band. You might be a Tolkien geek if every time you watch Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, you're constantly remembering all the things that he changed and left out. You might be a Tolkien geek if everybody around you gets mildly annoyed whenever you constantly talk about Tolkien. And finally, since everybody gets tired of you talking about Tolkien, you might be a Tolkien geek if you finally give up and just decide to start a YouTube channel where you can get all that Tolkien out of your system. So, hope that was enjoyable. Hope you found some humor, maybe saw a little bit of yourself in that video. Of course, there's probably at least a little bit of that in almost all of us, because typically, if you really love Tolkien, you tend to be a little extreme about it. So that at least is my experience. And there's people who enjoy Tolkien, and then there's people who really love Tolkien, and they're just way a step above everybody else in those terms. So anyway, I just thought this was funny. The idea occurred to me a few days ago, and it just sparked this huge long chain. So I just came up with as many of these ideas as I could. So what are your thoughts on this sort of a list? What other things can you come up with? What other you might be a Tolkien geek if can you come up with? Please leave those in the comments. In other news, I should point out that I have, some of you know, I've been working on a behind the scenes video for patrons at Patreon, and that's been super delayed, and I apologize for that, but I think I'm finally getting close to being able to finish that up, so that should be out in the near future. So be looking out for that if you're a patron. Speaking of patrons, of course, you can patronize the channel with this link over here. You can subscribe to the channel over here, and you can check out 2 of my previous videos here. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste, and stay geeky.